All right. I want to say welcome to everybody who is attending today. We're going to get started. This is our very first in a series of webinars that are going to be broadcast by Google Hangouts, brought to you by the American Bar Association Law Practice Division Solo and Small Firm Interest Group, which is a brand new group that's just started. My name is Jenny Stevens. I am an attorney in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I am the vice chair for this interest group. Our fearless leader, Rochelle Washington, who is a practice management advisor for the DC Bar. She had a conflict today. Hopefully she'll be joining us shortly, but she will be our leader for the following webinars that will come down the road. Today we're doing a webinar program titled eDiscovery for the Small Firm Lawyer, and our program is presented today by Kyle Albert of Foxhound. Foxhound is a unique partnership of lawyers and technology experts working together to provide small and medium-sized firms with large firm e-discovery capabilities. Kyle is a senior information technology manager with over 18 years of experience in ESI management, computer networking, mobile and web development, databases, server administration, end-user support, and project management. So basically, if it's out there, he does it. As one of the managing partners of Foxhound, he conducts forensic acquisition and preservation of ESI, manages document processing operations, and supports e-discovery document review, database administration, and data mining. He is particularly adept at managing resources in line with schedule and budget, providing training and support, and making workflow and technology recommendations to Foxhound's clients. Now, if you're like me and you work in a small firm and a lot of those words sound extremely intimidating and overwhelming, Kyle's here today to give us a little bit of insight and educate us on what we need to know as solo and small firms with regard to all of this new e-discovery that seems more prevalent every day. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kyle and sit back and enjoy the presentation. We do have some handouts that go along with this presentation. The link to those handouts, it's a PDF download that you can get just by going to the webinar description, and the link is now in the description information. So go there, download that, and I'm turning it over to you, Kyle.
Thank you, Jenny. I really appreciate it, and that was a nice introduction, and yes, there were a lot of long words in that in that bio. So, yeah, well, hopefully this will be very informative today. I've actually done some version of this presentation a few different times to some different groups, and it seems like people always get a lot out of it. So hopefully it'll be really useful. And you know, we do work with a lot of small law firms and a lot of solo practitioners, so we've seen a lot of the challenges that people can run into when it comes to dealing with technology when it relates to their cases and their clients, and trying to pull together all the documents they need to take a look at, and when they have to deal with things like, you know, productions that they have to deliver to the other side, and dealing with documents they get from opposing counsel and things like that. So we really enjoy helping people with things like that. And so today what we're going to try to do is kind of walk you through some of the basics of what you need to know when you're dealing with ESI and eDiscovery. I am going to turn on screen sharing, and hopefully this will work. Oh, whoa, that's weird. That'll stop in a second, I guess. All right, so hopefully the slides are up there now, and Jenny, you can let me know if for some reason you don't see them. But
they're looking great. We can see them.
This is our first time doing Google Hangouts, so we're on a technological journey of discovery today. So, yeah, like Jenny said in the beginning, we started Foxhound because we thought that small law firms shouldn't be at a disadvantage to some of the larger firms in dealing with eDiscovery, and we saw that happening. In fact, a couple of our partners that we started Foxhound with, they're at a small law firm, and they had that done to them a couple times, where they had just really gotten pounded by a larger law firm who had a lot of experience with eDiscovery and had a team of people behind them that could help them with it. And so, you know, one of the things we want to do today is kind of help you see that you don't have to be afraid of ESI and eDiscovery, and that you can actually use these tools even when you're in a smaller law firm. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So, you know, I like to show this because it is something. This particular topic is something that does seem to terrify some attorneys, and you know, people think there are a lot of challenges with dealing with ESI, and you know, when you don't understand something really well, it can be kind of scary. I mean, Jenny was just talking to me before we got started about her switch from a Windows machine to a Mac in her practice, and how it was kind of scary to her. And that's just how it is with technology. When you don't fully understand what you're getting into, it can be a little nerve-wracking. And really the best way to eliminate that fear is to gain some understanding. So we're gonna jump into some basics today. Before we get into the basics, though, I want to talk a little bit about where we've come from. But before that, you know, you might be saying, okay, look, I'm an attorney. Why do I have to learn about all this computer geekery stuff? And the answer is, well, you don't have to, but you should probably consider some of these points before you completely run out the door. You know, increasingly today, and we all know this is just how we communicate. It's how we do business. It's all over digital devices of one type or another, whether it's our iPhones or via email, of course, video chat, things like this, Google Hangouts, social media posts. You know, it's how we do business, and it's how our clients do business. You know, we put this slide up to show that when you're talking about, if your client is a business, even if it's a small business, they're probably dealing with mostly electronic data these days, emails, electronic documents. They probably don't deal with a whole lot of paper. Even if you're dealing with something like family law, we've helped attorneys who are involved in, you know, divorce cases, and even there, a lot of the information is electronic. And, you know, think about this. If you don't know how to handle ESI in your case, what happens if your client just simply can't produce something that's relevant in paper format? What if the most relevant information is stuck in text message exchanges on their smartphone? You know, how do you collect that data and deal with it? And, you know, as attorneys, I see this day in and day out. You know, when you're dealing with whether it's litigation or family law or something like that, you know, you're dealing with two sides here, and any kind of leverage that you can get over the other side is going to help you and your client out, right? So if the opposing counsel doesn't have a basic understanding of how this stuff works, and you do, then you are setting yourself and your client up for an advantage over the other side. And I think, as many of you probably know, there are many courts now that are starting to require ESI. Here in Virginia, we have the Eastern District of Virginia right here in Alexandria, the Rocket Docket there. They require every case that goes through there to deal with all discovery has to be electronic. And states like Florida are requiring it now. So in a lot of cases, you're just not going to have any choice about it. And just in case you're still not convinced, let's look at what some of the judges are saying. This is Judge James Francis out of New York's Southern District, and this was at a panel discussion he was on last year at Legal Tech New York, and he was talking about technology and eDiscovery, and he said that really he views attorneys who are unaware of the nuances of eDiscovery as essentially engaging in a slow career suicide. So it's something that you've really got to think about tackling, and you know, but also keep in mind that you may be going into a courtroom where the judge may not understand all the basics either, and really that's another opportunity for you to step up and sort of be an ESI hero, as we like to say. You know, you can step up and show that judge that you understand the technology, you understand the terms, and you get the process, and you might be able to help educate the judge a little bit, and that's always fun when you can do that. So something that a lot of attorneys don't consider is that there are really kind of two different ways you can use electronically stored information. There's really an offensive aspect to it and a defensive aspect. For example, in a normal eDiscovery request, you want to learn the other side's rules in terms of their technology rules, so that you can make sure they follow those rules. You can ask the other side things like, how are you preserving your information that's relevant to this case? What custodians have the data? Is the data destroyed periodically? Do you have backup systems, and how often is the data backed up and where? And by asking the right kinds of questions like that, you really show the other side that you know your stuff, and it's likely going to put them back on their heels a little bit. And on the other side of the coin, in a defensive aspect, you have to make sure that your client understands the rules of preservation to prevent spoliation. Gathering the information early, making sure you don't turn over privileged information inadvertently. There's always things you can do, like put in clawback provisions in case something's turned over inadvertently, but that only goes so far. I mean, you can't make the opposing counsel unlearn what they've learned if you disclose something that contains your entire case strategy. And you got to make sure that what you're doing as an attorney falls into acceptable standards for producing ESI. So clearly, in today's day and age, you're going to be expected to understand the basics of technology and know how to utilize it in all aspects of your career to help your firm, help your clients, help your team. So let's talk about how you can roll up your sleeves and start learning this stuff a little bit. And maybe today we'll kickstart that journey for you. But before we jump into the terms and explaining it, one thing I want to be clear about is you don't have to spend years getting the equivalent of a bachelor's in computer science degree. Okay, you just need to have a grasp of the basics. And if you feel kind of intimidated when you're starting to learn some of these terms, just remember you're smart. Okay, you've gone to law school, so you can learn this. It's not that hard. You don't have to try to remember everything that you learn along the way. You don't have to try to remember everything that we're going to cover today. As Jenny mentioned at the top of the presentation, we have some reference materials that go along with this presentation. The entire slideshow is in there, but also some links to some further reading that you can do on your own. There's some great websites that you can sort of keep handy and reference them when you need to. Even computer geeks like me don't always remember all of this stuff. We have to look things up quite a bit. So first of all, let's do a quick overview of the eDiscovery process, or at least the way it usually plays out. So this is a handy diagram of the process that was developed by a group called EDRM, which is an organization that's attempting to shape standards for eDiscovery. And the process flows from left to right. And as you can see across the bottom area, the volume of data is usually pretty high in the beginning, but it slowly decreases while the data relevance increases, and that's the sort of green area over on the right. And so information management, which is on the far left there, is what companies and individuals are usually doing day to day, regardless of any litigation, right? It's just how you deal with your email, it's how you deal with your backups and how you store records and all of that kind of thing. And then, once a case is about to start, then the process really begins with identification of custodians, keywords, systems that may hold relevant data, trying to identify all of that kind of stuff at the beginning. And from there, preservation of the data and collection of the data can begin. Once collected, it has to be processed, reviewed by attorneys, analyzed. Documents have to be marked as privileged or relevant and non-relevant, etc. And then productions can be made to hand over relevant data to opposing counsel. And finally, the presentation of that data in the trial or in maybe a deposition is kind of over there in the right at the end. So we're going to actually talk a little bit more in detail about some of these, but that hopefully gives you a nice overview of the whole process. So let's talk about some of the tech terms that you hear related to ESI so we can clear up some of that. And one of the big ones is there's often a lot of confusion about data sizes, right? So you hear these terms like megabytes and gigabytes, and it can be confusing to try to put that into some context and make it relevant. What is a gigabyte of data? How much information is that? So let's try to relate that to some real things. So let's look at just plain text. So think of text in a very simple text document, not even necessarily Word, where you might throw pictures in there or something like that, but think of like Notepad on Windows or text editor on the Mac, just basic text with no pictures or anything. Then here's what we're talking about when we look at data sizes. So one single letter or character, it could be a number or a special character, anything like that, that's 1 byte in terms of computer data sizes. Then moving up from there, a kilobyte you can think of as about half a page of text. And then you go up from there to a megabyte, which is about 1 thick book. And then a gigabyte, which is the word you hear a lot when you start talking about eDiscovery, is often the case. And the way to think about that is it's about 1,000 thick books. And if you go all the way up to a terabyte, which is the next step up from there, that's about 1 million thick books. Now, if you're talking about other kinds of data like video or audio or pictures, those comparisons don't really hold up. But in litigation, a lot of times we're dealing with text. So these are good benchmarks to kind of keep in your mind. But just keep in mind that when you're dealing with, if you're collecting up a bunch of documents, say from someone's email account, and they say, oh, I've got a gigabyte of data, well, don't automatically assume that that's the equivalent of 1,000 books necessarily, because there could be pictures in there could be videos, there could be music files, things like that. Okay, so now that we understand the difference between a megabyte and a gigabyte, at least at the basic level, let's take a look at the early stages of the eDiscovery process. So this is the phase where you're going to be working with your client to try to identify the data that they have that needs to be preserved and collected. And I really want to stress this is a really important stage here, because you're thinking about not only what your client has, but you also need to think about what you're going to ask for from the other side. What format do you want it to be produced in? What date ranges do you need to worry about? Keywords. What are the custodians that you're most interested in seeing data from? And really, custodian, if you're not familiar with that term, that just means a person who you're collecting data from. So you might, if you're pulling from 3 different, let's say you're doing litigation in a small case in a small company, and they have 3 employees, and you're pulling their email accounts from all 3 of those people, then you've got 3 custodians. That's one of those ESI kind of terms that we often throw around. So once you've kind of gotten through that identification part, you're going to start by preserving and collecting the data from your client, and that's where digital forensics comes in. Now, in some small cases, you don't have to worry too much about this. We're helping a solo practitioner right now with a case that he has, and in their particular case, eDiscovery wasn't required in their case, but there are a lot of electronic documents, and he worked with the opposing counsel, and he said, look, we're not going to worry about collecting metadata off of these documents. We're just going to produce documents to each other. We're going to agree that we don't need to worry necessarily about getting a truly forensically sound preservation. So sometimes that's fine, and if the judge is okay with that, then great. But if you do have to worry about it, then that's where you might have to bring in an expert to make sure that they do it in a forensically sound manner. Because if your client just copies some files onto a flash drive and hands it to you, well, those files have actually been modified in the process of being copied over to that flash drive. And so there are ways that you can copy that data in a forensically sound manner, and you might have to reach out to somebody to help you with that. So one of the terms you hear sometimes here is imaging, in terms of imaging a hard drive. So if you're dealing with a larger case where there's a lot of data and you've got maybe a bunch of different custodians, you may have heard the term, heard someone say something like, oh, we've got to make sure we image all the hard drives from each of these custodians. And what people mean when they say that in this particular case is they're talking about making an exact duplicate or a mirror image of that hard drive on that computer. Or it could be a CD, or it could be a flash disk, or it could be anything. It doesn't have to be necessarily a hard drive from a computer, but you get the idea. So we often, one of the things we try to help our clients do is control costs, and this is one of the areas where costs can get out of control, because this is usually overkill to do a full image of a complete hard drive. In civil litigation, it's just usually not necessary. Usually what we will do when we help people do forensics collections is we'll either collect maybe an entire email account, or we might collect, if we're doing it off of a computer, we might collect a copy of that custodian's user folder from the computer, and we ignore all the other folders on the computer that aren't where they would store their working data on a day-to-day basis. And there's ways to do that in a forensically sound way, but without having to do an image of the entire hard drive, because that would gather up a lot of data that you don't really need. So now you've gotten your ESI collected, and now you have to put all that data somewhere, right? And if you're a small law firm, this is where things again can get a little bit tricky, because this could be a lot of data potentially. And this is where the term hosting often comes into the picture. So someone needs to host this data. Now, if it's a small case and it's a small amount of data, you might be able to set a computer aside at your law firm and store it on that one computer. The problem with that is, it is cheaper, but the problem is that if you're going to have multiple people that need to do review on that data, then it's not very convenient, because now each person has to sit at that computer and use it one at a time, and you can't have multiple people reviewing, and they can't do it from some other location. So what a lot of companies do is they'll choose to go to an outside eDiscovery vendor, and they will host the data in a data center, and that's what you see here in this picture. Is that's something kind of like what our data center looks like. So they put the data on their servers, and they can make it accessible to you remotely over the web, so that you can do it from home or do it from the office, and multiple people can review the data at the same time. And that's the thing that you get by hosting it with someone else, typically. So at this point, you're moving into the processing, analysis, and review phase. So what are we talking about there? So the first thing is processing, which just means that when you've got that data collected, and now you have to go in and do a few things to it. So there are specialized software applications that are usually built for this purpose. We have the software we use is part of a complete end-to-end eDiscovery platform called Digital War Room, and so we use Digital War Room to handle this step, a lot of this step for us. Other people use different tools, but so some of this is automated, but some of this does still require someone with some expertise to take a look at the data and make sure that everything's right, because you're going to run into things like files that are corrupted or files that are password protected. Compressed files have to be uncompressed, and you want to identify duplicates at this point, because once you get into the review stage, you don't want to be looking at the same document over and over again, which is amazing how often that can happen. Because if you think about it, you're collecting data, even if, say for example, in a very small case, let's say it's a small company and you've collected data from their company share drive and the company owner's email account. Well, how many of those documents that are on the share drive are the same document that appears in multiple emails because he was attaching it to emails, or other people were attaching it to emails that they were sending to him? And so that's one of the things you can do at this stage, is identify those duplicates. And the other thing you've got to do is index all of the data, which is just a fancy way for saying the computer analyzes all the text in all the files and creates an index of all that text, so that when you get into review and you want to do a search for a particular term, it knows where to find that term in the various documents. So all that has to be done at this step, and if it's done right, it actually can help you decrease your review costs, as you will have weeded out some of the non-relevant stuff before review even begins. So I'm not going to get into a whole lot in necessarily the review step, only because probably most of you are familiar with doing document review, even if you've only done it in paper. But one thing I do want to cover really quickly is people often ask at this point about something called predictive coding. It's also known as technology-assisted review. And so let's look at that for a second. So the idea is that special computer programs that have these very advanced search algorithms can be used to help you go through large sets of data very quickly and hopefully in a more cost-effective way than having lawyers do it. So what usually happens is you create a set of seed documents. So the attorney or maybe a few attorneys, they review a sampling of the documents that have been collected, and they create kind of a set of search words, and they help create these initial documents that they feed into the computer program and say, hey, these are the kinds of documents we're looking for, and these are the kind of terms we're looking for. And then the computer application can then analyze all the words and characteristics of those documents, and it tries to go out across the entire data set and find all of those documents. So, if you're dealing with a lot of data, and especially if you're a small law firm, this sounds pretty appealing, right? Because it's sort of like, hey, I can get the computer to do most of the work for me. And it can help. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There is still some debate about whether or not it's really quote unquote better. What we've seen is that it can get fairly pricey, even though it's supposed to save money. It really seems to only be effective in terms of both the technology sense of effectiveness, but also in terms of cost. It seems to be best used where you have really large amounts of data. So if you're a small law firm and you've got a small client dealing with a small amount of data, you probably don't need to worry about it. But I did want to cover it here. So bottom line is, it's not necessarily an easy button that you can hit that will just kind of magically make everything. It'll magically spit out all the results for you out of the other end. But if you do get involved with a case that has a lot of data, it is something to consider, and you'll want to bring in somebody who has done that before and has the right kind of software that can make it happen. So, I talked about the fact that review, and that's kind of the next step here, and that's really where you're, and I'm sure you can imagine, that's really where the attorney is spending the most of their time. Up to now, you've had other people probably helping you out with getting the data ready. But now you've got to go through and actually look at documents that may be potentially relevant. And this is where your choice of what software you're going to use to do this becomes really important. And so sometimes we talk about the eDiscovery platform that you're using. And when we say platform, we just mean the software application or maybe the set of applications that's going to allow you to manage and review all those documents. Just as an example, I mentioned that we use Digital War Room. And so I just wanted to show an example here, because the choice of the eDiscovery platform you're going to use will kind of, in some respects, drive the workflow that you are going to use to go through a review, and it can affect how efficient you will be. It might also dictate to some extent what kinds of documents you can review and what format the data should be produced in from opposing counsel. So those are things you should probably think about if you're going to bring in an outside eDiscovery consultant to help you with this stuff. And so you can see here in this screenshot, I've kind of grayed out all the sensitive items in this, but you can just kind of see this is what maybe a typical eDiscovery software application might look like, where you've got a list of documents in the main area for review, and on the bottom there's a document preview that allows you to, once you click on a document and select it, it shows you the preview at the bottom, kind of like an email application. And on the left, there are various filters you can use to show and hide different documents or conduct text searches, things like that. So, however you and your team identify relevant documents, you've then got to produce them and deliver them to opposing counsel. So, that's something you're going to be, worrying about once you get review complete and you've marked your documents. And but again, this is the digital age, so we're not going to deliver boxes and boxes of paper, right? Instead, we're going to do something more like this, where you're going to deliver data, electronic data, to them on some kind of media, and however you work that out with opposing counsel. What's not really shown here, because it's kind of hard to show, is what seems to be most commonly happening now is that people do it kind of in the cloud. So, like, for example, what we've done is we've set up our own private file sharing server. It's kind of like a private Dropbox, and that allows our clients to post productions there in a secure way that's password protected, and then the opposing counsel can go log on to the system and grab those files whenever they want them. And what's nice about that is it gives you a log of when they accessed it and who did it and that kind of thing. So you can, if there's ever any debate about, oh, you didn't deliver those to us, you can always pull up those records. So when we're talking about productions, we start to get into some more confusing terms, and especially there's some eDiscovery vendors that throw around a lot of confusing terms here. So we start talking about native productions versus image, or sometimes you hear TIFF or near native or PDF. I didn't even throw that word up here, but what does all that mean? Well, let's think back for a second. We were talking about forensic data collection and forensic image, and we were using the word image there, and now we're using the word image again. And so are those the same meaning here? Well, it's not quite the same, but they do both involve making a copy. So when we talked about imaging a hard drive, you were making a mirror image basically of the entire hard drive. Well, in the case of ESI, an image production just means you're making an image copy of the original documents. So when we say native, we mean the original documents. That's whether the file was maybe a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. So if we're saying we're doing a native production, then we're saying we're going to be handing over to opposing counsel those files the way they were originally created or maintained on that system. Now, if we're talking about image or TIFF, or I should throw in here PDF, then what you're doing is you're taking that original document and you're converting it basically to a picture that may not contain all the same metadata that was in the original file, but it's going to look very similar because it's like a scanned document, if you've ever seen that. And then the term near native, you may not encounter that too much. It was an attempt at one time to kind of try to bridge the gap between original and native and image. It usually means converting the original into like an HTML type format, and it automatically preserves a lot of the metadata. But it seems like most people aren't using that term anymore, but I put it here just in case you run into it. So really briefly, what the heck is a TIFF? So TIFF is just a file extension, and it stands for Tagged Image File Format. So it just means it's an image. So you can think of it as, like I said, you take a Word document, and if you run it through a scanner, you end up with a scanned image of that document at the end, and that can be a TIFF file, could also be a PDF. And here's an example, and you can see the handwriting on there. This is actually a document that I signed, so that's one thing you can get out of something like that. But you don't have to actually, in an eDiscovery case, if you have a lot of documents to produce, you hopefully are using some kind of software that will automatically create those image or PDF files for you instead of having to run them through a scanner. So people sometimes ask, why do we have these different options? I mean, why don't we just do one, everything is one all the time? And the problem is there are advantages and disadvantages to the different options. So first of all, some files are better kept native. So think about an Excel spreadsheet, a really complicated Excel spreadsheet. If you've ever tried to print a complicated Excel spreadsheet out to paper, you know that doesn't really work so well. So leaving that as a native might be the best way to go. But on the other hand, leaving them as native means you probably can't stamp a Bates number or some other kind of endorsement on each page, and you really, I shouldn't say you can't redact. It's hard to redact a native file. There are ways to do it. You probably have to work it out with the opposing counsel to make sure that you both agree how you're going to do that. But it does make it more difficult to redact. And the other thing you run into sometimes is if you ask the other side for, okay, I want all your documents in native file format, and then they give them to you, and it turns out that there's some weird files in there that you need some proprietary software to open. So for example, we've seen this in cases that deal with medical imaging systems, like if you've ever been to have a CAT scan or MRI or something like that done, they'll give you a CD, but on that CD is the special proprietary software that you need to look at those images. And if you got those files just separate from the software, you might not be able to open them. And the other thing too is imaging. Imaging a large production takes more time, and that can mean being more expensive. We try to recommend that people do native productions just for time and cost reasons, but we've had clients all over the map on this. We have some people who just want to do everything in PDF or TIFF, and then other people are willing to do a hybrid approach where they image most of the documents, but they leave some, like Excel files, as natives. So it's something to think about at the beginning, because you want to work that out with opposing counsel ahead of time. So finally, you may have to present some of your ESI in depositions or in court, and we don't really have time today to delve into the details of presentation, but again, the erdm.net website has some really useful information on this part of the process, and if you can bring in an ESI expert, that could really help you at this stage as well. So I said earlier that we weren't going to jump into a lot of detail on the review process, but I do want to say a little bit about privilege logs. So if you've had to do a privilege log, you know that this is the way, a lot of people still do it this way, actually, where you're manually generating and tracking that log by doing an Excel spreadsheet. And if you're dealing with multiple people, it starts to become a real hassle, and it's difficult. So you want to think about that, ahead of time. And again, this is where choosing the right eDiscovery platform can really help. So your platform of choice should have built into it some tool for dealing with your privilege log. So for example, in Digital War Room, this is another screenshot from Digital War Room, and if you mark a document as privileged, then you can see on the right-hand side there's a privilege metadata tab that you can go into, and it automatically will capture for you any metadata that's associated already with that file, like the who created the file, who the recipients were, the date, things like that. And then you can just pick from a drop-down list what your privilege reason is, and then click Save. And then what's nice is you just do that as you're going through your documents, and you kind of slowly build it up. And so at the end, all you have to do is click a button, and it generates your privilege log for you based on all the information you entered all along the way when you marked something as privileged. So that's something to think about. It can really help a lot and make the experience a lot faster and more accurate. So based on what we just covered, do you think you know enough now to consider yourself an ESI hero? And maybe not. Maybe you need a sidekick. So if you need to bring in some outside help, that's what we're going to talk about next, because this is another part of the process that is kind of daunting. And as small law firms, there's a lot of things you have to rely on outside vendors for help with, right? Like you don't have a staff of people necessarily to fix your computers or set up your phones, or so how do you deal with that kind of stuff? So you may need to go find an eDiscovery vendor to come in and help you. And sometimes that usually means eDiscovery cases are going to be a little bit more expensive, but it doesn't mean you have to get ripped off. So you don't want to feel like you've been working with a used car salesman, right? So so finding the right consultant is a real critical part of this, I think. And if you can find somebody, I think that's a good way to go, especially for smaller law firms. And so what are you looking for there? Well, you're looking for someone who understands the law, but also understands the technology. I think it's really important for small law firms to consider exactly what kind of service the company is offering, because there are a lot of eDiscovery service providers out there that really only offer you the software and a place to host your files, but they don't offer anything beyond that. And we've had clients who we've worked with who started out with one company, and then they get into a part of the case where they need help. They need someone who's knowledgeable about, for example, crafting really complicated search algorithms to help them find particular types of documents in their data set. And the eDiscovery vendor they went with sort of says, hey, sorry, that's not what we're here to do. You're on your own. And so, you want to look for someone who's, I guess, considered a full-service eDiscovery vendor, who's got people who can actually help you out with some of those challenges. And you want to bring that person in as early as possible, because we've been brought in on cases where they're already midway through the case or near the end, and some decisions have already been made about how to do productions that are actually really killing the team in terms of their budget and the time that it's taking them to do things. So the right eDiscovery consultant can help you figure all that out ahead of time. Trying to figure out things like, what information systems are we dealing with? How much ESI do we think we're going to have, and what types of ESI, and what do we want to request from the other side, and what format should we ask for it in, and all that kind of stuff. Now, the other thing to think about is pricing models that different eDiscovery vendors use, and some providers charge on a per gigabyte basis for some of their services, but that can make smaller data sets very expensive. So you want to see if how do they ask them? How do they handle dealing with small cases? How do they handle dealing with small clients? It may be there's some of the big players in this space will just flat out tell you, hey, we don't really take on any work unless it's going to be more than $100,000 in terms of their piece of it, and that's not realistic for the vast majority of what small law firms are dealing with. You probably would have a hard time selling your client on spending $100,000 on eDiscovery. So think about that up front. So think about too, obviously budget is a big part of what small attorneys, small law firms are having to deal with, because they probably have a client who doesn't want to spin an arm and leg, or doesn't have the deepest pockets in the world, right? Your client is probably not ExxonMobil. So think about things up front that may help your client out with this, and I think they'll really appreciate it. So think about things like, how much data is there going to be, and how many custodians do you think you're going to get? Now, this can be hard to judge at the beginning of a case, and this is where, again, having a good eDiscovery consultant might really be able to help you out, because they've probably seen a lot of different types of cases and can probably judge just by the nature of the case how much data there's probably going to be and what custodians there are going to be. Think about how you're going to collect the data. If it's a small case and it's really not, you're not having to follow all the rigorous forensic protocols, then it might be fine for your client to gather up the files themselves. The problem you run into with that is that they're busy, right? They're running their business, or they're dealing with their lives, and they may miss a lot of things. So if you can convince your client to bring someone in to help with the data collection, you're probably going to get a much better end result. How many reviewers do you think you're going to need? Now, a lot of this is driven by how much of the document, how much of the data you're going to have to actually review, right? Because if it's just 100 documents, then maybe one reviewer is plenty. But if it's going to be 50,000 documents and you've got 2 weeks, then one's not going to cut it. You're going to need to bring in some help. And how do you do that? And how long is it going to take in each of these steps? Because again, what you don't want to get into is a situation where you're up against the wall and you've got a lot of documents left to review, and you don't have a lot of time left, and now you're having to go ask for more time, and all because you didn't quite do a good enough job up front thinking about it and estimating. So the more of these questions you can answer up front, the fewer surprises you'll have when you get down the road. So if you're talking to an eDiscovery provider, here are some things to ask them. We talked about before about how some people charge on a per gigabyte basis for some of their services. So ask if they do that, and if so, what services do they do that, and how do they measure the data size? Well, actually, we'll get into that in a second. But things like, do they provide fixed fee bids for smaller cases? And here we go. Do they measure the data size. If they're charging you by the gigabyte, then you kind of need to know, okay, where do you measure that? Do you measure it before processing or after processing? Or, is it all the data that gets collected, or are we just talking about data that's going to be hosted? Or what do you mean when you say you're charging us this this amount per gigabyte? What do they charge for data hosting? Do they charge for each user who needs to be able to access, each reviewer that you need to have access the data? And if so, how much is that? Another big one is, ask them, do you have a way to charge us a much lower rate if the case gets put on hold, kind of a standby rate? That's a good one to know too, because as we know, things happen, and you don't want to necessarily be paying the same rate to have the data being hosted somewhere when you're not really doing anything with the data. So our partner who actually makes Digital War Room gave us some useful metrics. So this may help you when you're trying to figure out your budget for dealing with eDiscovery cases. So first of all, when you're thinking about data, and this is for typical civil litigation, so two businesses or maybe partners within a business are involved in a case, and you're dealing with sort of your typical office type documents. So 80% of what we see is email data, and 18% is PDF and other office type documents like Word and Excel, and everything else is 2%. So it's largely driven by email, which probably isn't too much of a surprise, but that's good to know. The average review speed, now this can vary, but it's usually 100 to 150 unique documents per hour. So that's a good number to keep in mind if you're planning your budget. If you say to yourself, gee, I think I'm going to end up with 2,000 different documents that need to get reviewed and we need to make some kind of decision about, and you kind of think about this number, now you have a rough ballpark for how many hours it's going to take you to get through those documents, and that can help you judge, okay, do I need to bring in maybe a contract attorney to help me do the review here? So the next one is, only of all the data that gets collected, only about 30% of that gets reviewed. So you are probably going to have a lot of data that ends up getting collected up when you do your collections that just end up not being relevant and don't need to be reviewed at all. And then of that, all of the data that was collected, between 7 and 14% of that usually gets produced. So you can see it gets whittled down quite a bit going through the process. So to kind of wrap this up, we think this is a great way to set yourself apart from other attorneys by embracing kind of this future technological revolution that we're in the middle of, and really trying to become an ESI hero. And it brings you some really powerful tools to your tool set that you can use to serve your clients well and make a name for yourself out there. So as Jenny mentioned before, we have some reference documents that you can keep handy and use them to look up things as you need it. Like I said, even technology folks like me don't always remember all the terms, so we have to go look things up ourselves quite a bit. And so at this point, I'm going to wrap it up and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm trying to see if we have the ability to do questions and answers, and that might be something that Kate has to turn on.
Yeah, I think there is a Q&A log, but yeah, it maybe we're not going to do questions.
Well, I'm sending her a message, so let me check. It's disabled for this one. So I'm going to wrap it up by saying thank you for this very, very much. Your resources were wonderful. I was flipping through those while you were presenting, and your slides were excellent. I'm assuming that your contact information is also at the end of those materials as well. And if not, we can provide that in the description information too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the last slide there had our website, and you can always you can reach out to me via the info@fxhnd is kind of our informational website, email address, I mean. And then we have a contact form on our webpage too, so if people want to just go there, they can always reach us that way.
Great. Well, you may get some follow-up questions, because this is one of those areas that when I see a presentation, I know that I can put it to use, and then 5 minutes after the presentation, all those big words start running together, and I'm immediately looking for my little partner, somebody to take my hand and guide me through it. So I'm sure there's others out there too. And just for the viewers out there of this webinar, like I said in the beginning, for those of you who weren't with us, this is just the first in a series that we're doing this year. So stay tuned. There will be some more information about the next program, which I think is coming up. I don't know that we've got a scheduled date for it yet, but Rochelle will have all of that information, and it'll be shared on the ABA website, of course, very soon. And the materials for this, for those who were not with us initially, if you go into the Google Hangout description and say View More, because it only shows you like a little snippet, click View More, and there is a link to the Dropbox materials right there. You can download them as a PDF and keep those as a resource. And this webinar will also, we've been recording the whole time, so it's my understanding that you will actually be able to reference back to this webinar in the future. So you can, if you didn't catch everything, or you're like me and you were madly taking notes and maybe missed something, you can go back and review it again later, or share it with your friends and your colleagues. And it's going to be located on the ABA Law Practice YouTube page, which, who knew we had a YouTube page? Good job. So check it out there, and we look forward to seeing all of you and all of your friends back for our next webinar in the series. So thank you, Kyle. We really appreciate you doing this for us today, and we appreciate all the information.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.